So my name's Aparna Sundar. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm located here in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people, and subject to the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This land was stewarded by the Mississauga of the Credit River and is home to many Indigenous people, including the Métis, and those displaced from their homelands by Canadian extractive and other industries. Acknowledging the history of this land is particularly relevant to today's topic, which is, of course, climate change, climate catastrophe in South Asia, taking action in Canada. Doing this land acknowledgement, acknowledging this history is relevant because Indigenous communities have long highlighted how environmental destruction is tied to colonization and dispossession, and Indigenous principles of stewardship are crucial to which is the acknowledgement of rights and responsibilities, remind us of our joint responsibility to care for and nurture these lands and these waters, and to struggle for a better future for the earth and all peoples. In terms of the format, and I'll talk about the panel a little bit, but just in terms of the format, I'll just introduce the panel, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for each of our three speakers, who I will, of course, introduce. And then we'll have time for a pretty fulsome question and answer session. So we're looking forward to that session and hearing from the speakers in particular. So just to introduce the panel and what motivated it. The panel is the brainchild of Seniors for Climate Action Now, or SCAN, and many of the members are present, and Nick, who I will introduce from the panel, and Pramila are amongst the organizers here. SCAN was formed with the goal of expanding the presence of seniors within a broad-based climate movement in Canada. And the reason why for this panel is the events of last year, the unprecedented flooding in Pakistan in July 2022, a country that contributes a very tiny percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions, the extreme heat events experienced across the northern plains, both in India and in Pakistan, with sort of strange consequences like the falling dead of birds in the cities, dead birds falling from the skies, and then, of course, other kinds of extreme flooding events, including in Bangalore in India and in the south of India, and then followed by the COP27, the climate summit in November last year, where despite some gains, countries like Canada continue to resist committing to targets that would impose actual financial commitments on them. All of these events sort of coming together led SCAN members to feel the urgent need to bring attention to the role of emissions tied to patterns of extraction, production, and consumption in Canada and other countries of the North in contributing to these kinds of disasters and catastrophes in the global South, and specifically in this case, in South Asia. So SCAN members reached out to South Asian diasporic organizations here, the Committee of Progressive Pakistani Canadians and India Civil Watch International, with the goal of building solidarity and common action with the South Asian community here in Toronto and in Canada more widely. So the event has also been co-sponsored by other organizations connected to South Asia, Jamhoor.org, Critical Diasporic South Asian Feminisms, the South Asia Diaspora Action Collective in Montreal, and York University's Center for Asian Research, or YCAR. So thanks to all of them for their support in promoting this event. And as I said before, Jamhoor will be hosting this panel on its website. The panel is the first of what will hopefully be a longer-term project of working together between SCAN and South Asian organization and community members here to carry out education and action about the responsibility of Canadians for what appear to be distant events in other parts of the world. The title of the panel is a little misleading, for it suggests that the catastrophe is only in South Asia, whereas we know that it's planetary. And we're seeing the effects in the fires and floods on the west coast of this continent, in BC and in California. But it's important for climate activists here to gain a better understanding of the particular contours of the crisis in South Asia, recognizing the role of an unequal global economic order and of local and regional geographies and political economies, rather than making blanket generalizations about the nature and scope of the problem. There's no doubt about the urgency and catastrophic nature of what we're witnessing, and yet it's necessary that we do not have catastrophist approaches or solutions. Without an understanding of the social impacts of these solutions, without tying them to political economies of work, livelihood, and production, they only exacerbate the problem for the most vulnerable. Solutions to climate change have become an industry in themselves, and international aid, for instance, is increasingly tied to climate solutions, such as reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, or what's called REDD+, or the creation of conservation areas or bunds and coastal walls to hold back rising seas. But these solutions often result in excluding and displacing the inhabitants of these fragile ecologies who depend on them for their livelihoods, and then create their own problems and new dependencies. So questions of global and local inequality remain unaddressed, nor is there questioning of the models of growth and development that cause a range of environmental problems, such as the rapid highway and other construction work in the Himalayas that recently created the terrifying subsidence of mountainsides and towns in Uttarakhand. Nor is there mention or recognition of the authoritarian governments who use climate justice claims on the global stage while actively suppressing and withholding data, disregarding science, and criminalizing communities that resist crisis, dispossession, and displacement. So given all this, we need a complex analysis of the catastrophe that takes all of this into account. But we also need to hear that people in South Asia are engaged in confronting these problems, that there are movements and struggles that pose the joint questions of social and economic justice and climate crisis jointly together, and with whom we can work in solidarity and alliance. And that's why for this panel, we sought out and are fortunate to have speakers who are deeply rooted in their context and can speak to the transformations of the local and the struggles on the ground in local, regional, and national spaces, but who can also address questions of global political economy and social justice. Speakers who are scholars, but also engaged in policy work and public action. And so we're very fortunate to have these speakers, and I'll just go on to quickly introduce all three of our speakers and then invite them to speak. Our first speaker is Dr. Nausheen Anwar. She's a fellow of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, UK, a professor of city and regional planning at the Institute of Business Administration, Karachi, and is the founder and director of the Karachi Urban Lab, which is an interdisciplinary collaborative program of research, teaching, mentoring, and advocacy focused on understanding the challenges of urbanization, planning, infrastructure development, and climate change in the global South. Dr. Anwar is an urban planner, and her research is situated at the intersection of urban planning, urban studies, geography, anthropology, and political ecology. It addresses the challenges of climate change, violence, security, gender, land displacement, and disaster risk mitigation. Dr. Anwar has extensive experience in building cross-continental South-to-South partnerships and in managing large-scale multi-city projects, as well as working with grassroots organizations and local governments. Her current project investigates the impact of global warming in cities and explores practices of heat risk mitigation in an everyday context, and how these are central to challenges of urban planning, development, survival. Her book, Infrastructure Redux, Crisis, Progress in Industrial Pakistan and Beyond, explores the infrastructures underpinning visions of progress and development. I heard Nausheen speak at a global assembly on the catastrophic floods in Pakistan and climate reparations, organized by Code Pink last December, in which she spoke to precisely the kinds of questions we're interested in today, of the link between the global capitalist economy and climate crisis and the responsibilities of the global north. Our next speaker would be Dr. Sharachchandra Lele. Dr. Lele is a distinguished fellow in environmental policy and governance at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, or ATREE, in Bangalore, India. And he headed up the Center for Environment and Development at ATREE until 2018. He's an interdisciplinary environmental researcher, bridging the natural sciences, economics, and political science to understand the concepts of and pathways to environmentally sustainable and socially just development. He's worked on sustainable forest management and forest governance, forest hydrology and farmer linkages, watershed development, water governance, and pollution regulation. He's currently leading a major project on the impacts of climate change on water management in rapidly urbanizing basins in peninsular India, and is involved in other studies on water management in Bangalore city. Dr. Lele has published widely in influential journals, and amongst other books, most recently co-edited a volume called Rethinking Environmentalism, Linking Justice, Sustainability, and Diversity, published by MIT Press in 2018. He's been active in policy work and has served in various task forces on everything from forest government to water policy to thermal power, as well as being active on environmental issues locally in his city in Bangalore, as well as regionally, and speaking on topics such as framing climate change within a broader environmentalism. And it's these broader questions of environmental crisis and social justice that he takes up in an important recent article in the New Left Review of last year on environment and well-being that I would highly recommend. Our third speaker is Nick Carlo. He's one of the founders of SCAN. He's a longtime climate activist based in Toronto and working especially on questions of industrial labor and climate transitions. In the 1990s, he was one of the founders of an important initiative, the Green Work Alliance, that brought together workers facing factory closures, those campaigning around occupational and residential health and safety issues, and those working on new product designs that could bring together socially useful production and cooperative ownership. So welcome to all the speakers. We're very, very grateful for your presence, very privileged to have you with us today, and really look forward to hearing from you. And so I'll turn it over now to our first speaker, to Dr. Nausheen Anwar. And as I said before, each speaker will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes. Dr. Anwar, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak and participate in this excellent forum. So I'm going to just talk via my PowerPoint presentation, which I'm now going to share. And I'm pretty sure that I will not go beyond 12 minutes or so. And I hope everybody can see the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so I'll just very briefly give a summary of some of the more poignant critical issues relating to climate change impacts in Pakistan. But as Aparna had requested in an earlier email, that she would like for me to focus quite a bit more on floods. Quite a lot of my work actually focuses on heat, thermal injustice issues in the context of cities, but I do work on floods. These issues of heat waves and heat and floods are interrelated. But for the sake of this presentation today, I'll talk a little bit more about floods because the August 2022 monsoon rainfall and the ensuing floods across Pakistan have really been quite unprecedented. So Pakistan is already categorized as one of those nations that is in the top 10 most vulnerable to impacts of climate change across the world. And over the past 2 decades or so, Pakistan has suffered 153 adverse climatic events, and these typically have ranged from events such as heat waves. All the heat waves, the story about heat waves is a little bit more complex. It's not just one-time events. It's also extreme heat or chronic heat, which sort of sustains for considerably longer periods, and urban heat islands, etc. And then alongside this, droughts, as well as riverine flooding, flash floods, urban flooding, global glacial melts in the northern part of Pakistan, in the regions of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and beyond. Pakistan has some of the largest glaciers in the world in the northern parts, and these are now also melting. So, and these in turn, the melting is causing flash flooding in those particular parts of Pakistan as well. So it's a range of different kinds of adverse climatic events that is impacting different parts of Pakistan and in turn displacing people, impacting lives and livelihoods in very complex ways. Now, flooding across Pakistan has happened time and again. We saw what was deemed in 2010 unprecedented floods back then, which caused about $43 billion damages and economic losses, with 20 million people impacted and over 2,000 people died. And fast forward to 2022, we see equally massive amount of damages with substantially more people impacted. 33 million is the official figure. Unofficially, the numbers are much higher. 1,730 deaths recorded, although this again could be considerably higher because there are still parts of certain areas of Pakistan that still can't be reached. And this is largely in the southern region of Sindh and certain parts of Balochistan. And I'll just sort of highlight this on a map in a few seconds. And the rehabilitation cost estimated for putting people's lives back on the road to recovery and just putting infrastructures back onto the road to recovery, the official cost is somewhere around $16 billion at the very least, at the bare minimum. Now, the effects of this are very complex, and so we need to bear in mind that these effects or these impacts are not only regional, but these effects are also rural and the effects are also urban. So the question of scale and the complexity of scale is an incredibly important dynamic. And when I think of regions, the provinces of Sindh and Balochistan in the context of the 2022 floods account for approximately 50% and 15% of recovery and reconstruction needs, respectively. And this is according to a Government of Pakistan estimate that came out last year after the post-floods need impact assessment was done. And alongside these sorts of challenges, there are also intersectional effects, impacts on women, on children, on small farmers, on people of different religious, caste, and ethnic backgrounds. And within the context of cities, impacts on urban informal settlements or low-income settlements in riparian regions where issues of land ownership and tenure are particularly unstable. So the effects across these different scales, from the context of urban informal settlements coming into farming regions, agricultural zones. So these impacts have been particularly palpable in the southern province of Sindh. And this is a damage, loss, and needs by region breakdown that the Ministry of Planning came out with late last year. And as you can see from this table, that it is actually the province of Sindh that has been hit the hardest. And if we just sort of take a very quick look at the areas that were hit by the monsoon rains in 2022, so even though the monsoon rains and this torrential, unprecedented rainfall impacted the northern parts of Pakistan from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but it was largely also the geographical, the topographical, and there are other complex reasons behind this. Areas of Sindh and Balochistan that as the water began to flow and the dams burst, and the sort of colonial, post-colonial engineering systems that have been put in place for the last 100 years. So it ended up that certain parts of Balochistan and pretty much nearly all of Sindh and certain sections of Punjab, that is mostly southern Punjab, that these are the areas that suffered the most. So when we think of those 33 million displaced, it's sort of very large concentrations in terms of numbers in the southern parts of Pakistan. So the Government of Pakistan estimates that as a result of what we have seen happen last year, national poverty rate will increase by 3.7 to 4 percentage points. And this is going to then end up pushing between 8.4 to 9.1 million people into poverty. And this figure could be higher. Again, these are Ministry of Planning estimates, and no one has actually challenged these figures. Now, scientists say that this disaster was very much driven by global warming, the 2022 monsoon rainfall. And this is largely because Pakistan experienced its wettest August since the country began keeping detailed national weather records since 1961. And these, across these provinces, from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and especially in Balochistan and Sindh, the provinces that were hardest hit by floods received up to 8 times more rainfall than usual. And these are the statistics, the data that has been put out by the Pakistan Meteorological Department. Now, the lack of rainfall, however, there was something else that was happening before the August 2022 monsoon rains took place. It was the lack of rainfall throughout the first half of 2022 that further exacerbated these conditions. And this is the context of the longest and hottest heat wave situation that has ever been recorded in South Asia over its entire 122 years of meteorological records. Across March and April, we had back-to-back heat waves pretty much across South Asia. India was also suffering in pretty much in the same way at that point in time. And across March and April, with back-to-back heat waves, 13 cities across Pakistan, especially in the regions of Balochistan and Sindh, we saw maximum temperature records being broken, something, 45 Celsius, 50 Celsius plus. And the higher land surface temperatures in the central and the southern parts of Pakistan, as a result of the dry heat wave, then shifted the impact zone of the severe rainfall, largely again towards those particular regions, those southern parts of Pakistan. Now, sorry, let me just move on to the next slide. So is this disaster then a natural disaster? So while climate scientists say that unequivocally what happened in August of 2022 is an extreme weather event caused by climate change, the effects on ground also coalesced with certain kinds of complex colonial and post-colonial histories. In the regions of South Punjab and Sindh particularly, we see old British colonial irrigation networks that were put in place in the late 19th and early parts of the 20th century, a network that today has become inadequate for climate change-induced rainfall intensities. And alongside this, also histories of imperial patronage, which changed in the late 19th and early 20th century, land ownership and social structures in the favor of new landed aristocrats. And the combination of colonial irrigation networks, engineering systems, as well as changing land ownership and social structures have over the course of the last 100 years or so put vulnerable groups at much greater risk of what we see today as climate change impacts. And these now dovetail with, in the post-colonial, post-1947 context, the effects of the fetishization of mega infrastructures, certain kinds of developmental or planning paradigms that have rested upon funding from the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. A case in point in Sindh, for instance, is the now infamous construction of the left bank outfall drainage system in the early 2000s, which was built actually to create a situation that would mitigate floods, but has actually ended up now making or worsening the impact of unprecedented rainfall. And the LBOD, its funding, the manner in which the engineering aspect of this and the flawed design and its effects have ended up then blocking the natural watercourses in that particular part of Sindh. So the controversy of the LBOD has actually surfaced in a very resounding way in terms of climate activists on ground, wanting to take entities like the World Bank and the ADB and the sorts of planning paradigms and developmental paradigms that have unfolded over the past 50, 60 years, wanting to make them accountable alongside holding the government of Pakistan accountable as well in terms of these hydrological infrastructure legacies that have in turn left the poor even more vulnerable in these regions. So what we see is a combination of both colonial and post-colonial engineering systems, design flaws that have not really taken into consideration the natural flow of watercourses, the nuanced and more sensitive aspects of the natural ecologies of these regions. And this, combined with the uneven legacies of development, have then worsened the impacts of climate change on regions like Sindh and Balochistan, and very differently from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and especially from Punjab. So this is not necessarily just a natural disaster. And this is also a man-made disaster, but it is a man-made disaster that has very deep roots in both colonial and post-colonial legacies of planning and infrastructural development. Now, I just want to address very quickly this very complex issue of scale and vulnerability and its impacts. Now, climate change impacts in the southern parts of Pakistan as well as in other parts of Pakistan, but I'm going to be focusing largely on Sindh because this is where I am situated, in Sindh's largest metropolis in Karachi, and my colleagues and I are observing very closely now what is happening in this province in terms of the kinds of climate-induced migrations that are now taking place. So these recurrent cycles of flooding are actually pushing people towards cities. So in Sindh, in Hyderabad district alone last year, over 85,000 people were pushed into relief camps in the different cities across the Hyderabad district. And these are actually the official figures from the provincial government, and anecdotal evidence suggests that actually it might be well over 100,000. In Karachi district alone, unofficial estimates say that over 100,000 people migrated. And we saw the same thing happen in the post-2010 flood impacts. Many people did not go back, although we really don't have this very limited data on where these climate migrants are. I know we're not supposed to use the term climate migrants. People migrate for a wide variety of reasons. And one of these other very important reasons is the very long story of the seawater intrusion in the Indus Delta region. Almost 1.2 million people have migrated to Karachi over the last several decades as a result of what is happening in the Indus Delta. So this dynamic of seawater intrusion across the Indus Delta, the new extreme weather events, the more recent extreme weather events are overlapping, coalescing to sort of push more and more people towards urban centers. And one of the big challenges today is that our cities, our urban centers across Pakistan, and their governance systems and their financial systems and their municipal frameworks, are they prepared to handle these sorts of migrations and the effects of these migrations? And by and large, I would say absolutely not, because the urban aspect is hardly addressed in policy making. So there's a huge gap. So alongside the sort of damages that we saw happening in agricultural areas and rural areas in Sindh, even cities across Sindh like Chikobabad and Larkana and Karachi, Hyderabad and others were damaged very, very badly by floods. And for people living in informal or low-income settlements and slums located along the riparian regions, there was tremendous loss of life as well as livelihoods. And this really has not been recorded or highlighted or put on the radar with quite as much emphasis as, say, what has been more visible in terms of the agricultural or the devastation that has taken place in rural areas. And I would say that in the context of the sort of damages that we have seen in cities, over the last 6-7 months, these damages, loss of livelihoods and loss of life and the crumbling infrastructures is even more complex. And then alongside this, the gender-related issues, women's mental health concerns, the trauma that women have suffered in both the rural and urban context. These are the sort of things that are being discussed, but again, how they interrelate in terms of migration dynamics and how the rural and the urban sort of becomes part of a much broader terrain in scalar terms. These are the sorts of things actually that are not being openly discussed. I mean, the black box of this is not being opened in the way that it should be. So are climate reparations the answer? I believe, yes, absolutely. It is very important to discuss loss and damages. And it was very heartening to see that these sorts of things were being brought to the forefront at the COP last year. but it is also critical to hold the Pakistan government accountable. So floods, riverine, flash, urban have become the rule and not the exception in Pakistan. But policies are reactive, and that's one of the key reasons why they're not sustainable. So this is my last slide, and I'll stop in a few seconds. So the government of Pakistan has put out a new vision post 2022 floods to build back better. And this new vision is supposed to be very people-centered. But there are huge challenges associated with making this happen. Challenges of transparency, challenges of centralized institutions, limited understanding of scalar issues and the associated risks associated with gender-related dynamics, the kinds of maladaptive policies and interventions that can also arise through disaster risk mitigation. And one of the biggest challenges that I see is the challenge of upscaling people's knowledge, that in turn then it dovetails with issues of equity and social justice. And Aparna had asked me to reflect very quickly on what are the sorts of things that people living in the diaspora in Canada can do, for instance. And I think one can be better informed about the complexity of the problem, raise voice in the global forums for loss and damages, but also push for local voices to be included at multiple scales, to support climate activists who are working on ground in Pakistan. And this is actually a burgeoning terrain now. There are multiple voices, indigenous voices, and then, of course, building networks. And I think that this particular forum that we are participating today is actually absolutely brilliant. I had no idea that existed. So I think that these kinds of networks in turn are very powerful and perhaps are able to make a very important difference. So thank you. I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Nausheen, for being so on time and for such a brilliant, informative presentation. I'll move on and request Dr. Sharachchandra Lele to speak now.
Thank you, Aparna. And I'm going to use a presentation, but I hope I will not cause death by PowerPoint here. First of all, I want to thank you, you and the organizers of the event for giving me this opportunity to connect across continents and in fact also connect across borders with Nausheen. Nausheen, this was a wonderful presentation of yours because in a sense you've done most of my work. Whatever applies to Pakistan applies in magnified manner to India. But in a sense it's the similar kinds of processes and issues. So it was really nice that you could go in so much detail into some of the dimensions of climate impacts in Pakistan. Thank you. What I'm going to do is step back a little bit, talk for maybe a few minutes on the impact question, and then go on to look at the dimensions of responsibility and mitigation, because I think these are the two sides of the issue. And we've heard from Nausheen primarily about the question of impact and a little bit about how we might be able to adapt. But we need to also think in the link between the global north and the global south is this question of responsibility and therefore action towards mitigation. If we look at the impact of climate change in South Asia and particularly in India, there is a whole range of impacts, and Nausheen already mentioned several of them. Heat waves, cloud bursts, and I'm talking now specifically not just about the large flooding events that happened in Pakistan, but even the smaller cloud bursts that seem to be happening with increased intensity in small pockets, but with enormous impact in those local areas. And the third impact, which is kind of a slightly longer term event, is that the erratic nature of rainfall in the South Asian region and in India has increased. And as many of you might know, in spite of all these massive irrigation projects with dams and canals, and also a huge shift towards groundwater pumping, which makes India actually the world's biggest user of groundwater. Nevertheless, 2/3 of Indian agriculture is still not irrigated. And what that means is that this agriculture is dependent upon timely rains and adequate but not excessive rains. So although Indian farmers have over thousands of years developed strategies for adapting to erratic rain in rain-fed agriculture, they are now faced with the kind of erratic nature of rain which they have never seen in the past. Shifting patterns, changing patterns which nobody is able to predict, rain coming at the wrong time, the same amount of rain falling in lesser days than before and destroying crops that otherwise it would have really nourished and so on. So the impact of changing rainfall patterns and unpredictable change in rainfall pattern is huge in the agricultural sector. And then India has one of the world's largest or longest coastlines and a huge fisher folk population. So you have a massive impact on them through coastal flooding. And similarly, something that Nausheen mentioned earlier also is the issue of global glacier melt in the Himalayan region. Again, India has a very long Himalayan region, both on the western side and then in the eastern Himalayas. And glacier melt is really going to affect both in the short run through flooding, but also in the long run by making these regions bereft of the kind of permanent snow cover that they had, which was buffering and made these regions actually fairly fertile and conducive for human habitation. The loss of the glacier cover, the loss of the permanent snow cover is going to have a massive impact. And it's really important for us to understand something that Nausheen also mentioned, that these impacts are distributed across society within South Asia in a very lopsided manner. So in the news, we tend, especially in the global north, in Toronto or in New York, if you are living there and you're looking to hear some news about South Asia, you will hear much more news when there's flooding, for example, in Bangalore, which is called India's Silicon Valley. And I actually am a resident of Bangalore. And last year, we did see some crazy amount of flooding in the city of Bangalore. And these are just, typical pictures of what happens when the city floods. But we must remember that this is not the most or the biggest impact. It's the most prominent one in the media, but not necessarily the most important, because the people who are most affected are actually not necessarily in the city of Bangalore. They are in the rural areas, or they are migrants who are coming to cities seasonally for work, like this person in the train probably, and going back and living in slums, living in extremely poor conditions. Therefore, the most vulnerable, whether it is to urban heat waves or other kinds of impacts. We must remember that the flooding in Silicon Valley was a peculiar sort of combination of the Silicon Valley of Bangalore being in eastern parts of Bangalore, and the eastern part of Bangalore being most prone to receiving runoff from the center of Bangalore during a cloudburst kind of event. So otherwise, on average, you will see the poor, the migrant labor being the most affected. It's going to be the farmers who are most affected because of the increasingly erratic nature of rainfall in rain-fed agriculture. Fisher folk who are going to be hugely affected in sheer numbers and in impact in terms of the way ocean sea level rise and storm surges on the coastline are going to affect their livelihoods and their lives. So I think we need to understand that the impacts are multidimensional in terms of from glaciers to the coastal zone and from erratic rains to heat waves, but they also affect everybody. Within that, however, the most affected are people from those occupations that are hugely dependent upon ecosystems like the oceans, like agriculture, like the Himalayan glacier systems, or the areas just below the glaciers, alpine pastures, forests, and so on, where people live a livelihood very close to nature, and therefore changes in the natural, the behavior of natural ecosystems has huge impacts on their lives and livelihoods. Coming now to the question of how do we think about the question of mitigation? Because although we have already probably crossed 1 degree of change, sort of globally average change, we are still hoping that quick action can reduce the long-term impact or keep it below at least 2.5 degrees of change. How is this going to happen, and who's supposed to do it? Most importantly, we need to think about who has the greatest responsibility to mitigate. And it is interesting that this question of responsibility is often overlooked or oversimplified when we talk about climate change, because the tendency is to give the message that we are all in the same boat. It's a global problem. Therefore, everybody needs to take on some responsibility towards mitigation. Everybody needs to cut back. Everybody needs to do some amount of belt tightening. But really, the responsibility question is tied to how we understand the question of contribution. Who has contributed to climate change? And we hear typically statements like biggest emitters should take the most responsibility, which sort of seems intuitively right. But then when we try to understand what do we mean by biggest emitters, here's a statement from George Bush in the early 2000s. This is a challenge that requires 100% effort. Ours and the rest of the world's. The world's second largest emitter at that time is China, and yet China was entirely exempted from the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, remember that the US never signed the Kyoto Protocol at all. But this focus on saying China is, in today's parlance, it would be China is the world's biggest emitter, so China must do the most in terms of reductions. It was interesting, Aparna, that even when you introduced the subject, you said that Pakistan is a country that contributes a very small fraction of the total emissions globally. But my question is, should we even be using that kind of language? Because this picture is the picture of current share or 2017 shares in emissions. And this picture is what George Bush is talking about. China as 27% of global emissions. The US is only 15%. The EU comes to 10%. And Canada is at less than 2%. So India is much more than Canada. It's at 6.8% in 2017. So if we went by this language and this description of the problem, we would say, oh, China and India, as much as USA and EU, are responsible for the problem of climate change. But is this the right way to talk about contribution? For example, what about historic emissions? Because as you know, CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere over a 100-year period. And so the kind of climate change we are seeing today is also hugely related to what has happened in the past. And if you looked at the total emissions, for example, since 1950, then you get a very different picture. The cumulative emissions then in North America are just massive, and they're also very, very big in Europe. And in comparison, then India and China sort of start looking really, really small. And we're still talking about total emissions. But then we come to the next question, which is total emissions, whether current or historical, country-wise, is that the right way to compare? So as an analogy, I'd like to look at the question of GDP. India's GDP is more than $3 trillion today, and Canada's GDP is less than $2 trillion today. So now, if I were to just present these two numbers, would we say automatically that Canada is poorer than India? We wouldn't, because it's not about the total GDP. It's about the GDP per capita. It makes no sense to compare India's total GDP with Canada's total GDP, because the number of people in Canada is so much smaller than the number of people in India. And that would be like comparing India's GDP with Denmark's GDP or the GDP of Holland or something. It makes absolutely no sense to compare countries by their total GDP. We have to, when we talk about wealth, we have to talk about GDP per capita. So by the same token, when we talk about emissions, we should be talking about per capita emissions. And when we look at per capita emissions, the story is very different. So the US, even in 2018, was at 18.5 tons of CO2 per capita. Canada was higher. Canada has been consistently higher than the US for a number of historical and geographical reasons. And China, even though it's the world's sort of industrial hub, is at 9, and India is at 2.5. So look at the disparity in terms of per capita emissions between India at 2.5 tons per capita per year and Canada at almost 20 tons per capita per year. This is the kind of disparity we are talking about in terms of responsibility. And remember, again, this number of 2.5 versus 20 is current emissions or 2018 emissions. And if you added the historical dimension to the story, the disparity gets even more dramatic. The additional twist that we must remember is that these numbers are based on production, as in how much petroleum is being burnt or coal is being burnt within the borders of Canada versus within the borders of India or China or the US. But that's a production-based footprint, not a consumption-based footprint. This doesn't make a huge difference to India, but it makes a huge difference to Canada and the US, because a big chunk of the products that are consumed in Canada and the US actually come from China. So China is emitting CO2 in producing goods which are consumed in the global north. So should China be held responsible, or should it be the consumers in the US and Canada or Europe that should be held responsible? If you were to change the way of calculation, actually the per capita CO2 would go up by 2 to 6 tons, over and above already 16 and 18 and so on. So that's really something for us to keep in mind. And in addition, then we should be thinking about, of course, when you talk about responsibility to mitigate, we should be thinking about who has the ability to mitigate, who has the need to perhaps not mitigate or need to consume fossil fuels, who is the most vulnerable to climate change, and so on and so forth. It's therefore, in terms of allocating responsibility for action, we should be thinking about these other dimensions as well. But all these dimensions only make things more lopsided, because it means that the global north has the greater historical emissions, the greater current emissions per capita, the greater ability to do something about them, the lesser vulnerability to climate change, possibly looking at the kind of description that Nausheen gave us about what's happening in South Asia. So from all these perspectives, it gets even more and more lopsided in terms of who should be doing more and who should be actually receiving help in adapting to these this change that we have already set in motion, and who should be doing the maximum amount in terms of reducing emissions. In spite of this, and I'm just going to take this last minute to talk about how we are trying to deal with climate change, and this sort of parallels what Nausheen said, that if we look at what's happening in the climate change sector today, the big buzzword is restoration. And restoration has become some kind of a magic bullet or a silver bullet, where it's really a new tyranny, where the global north is trying to pay off the global south a small amount of money to go and plant trees or do similar kinds of activities to sequester carbon on behalf of the global north, as in the hope, which is a completely untenable hope, that will make a significant contribution to climate change mitigation. And this is wrapped up in this whole new magic trick of net zero, where we say the north will not really reduce its emissions, it will just buy up mitigation actions in the global south and therefore look like it is at net zero. And I think we need to all be aware of the kind of trickery that is going on in this game of net zero. And finally, forcing countries like India or even China to phase out coal. Now, unlike some other countries like the US and even Canada, which have huge reserves of petroleum, India really doesn't have any reserves of petroleum, any significant reserves of petroleum. The biggest fossil fuel they have access to is coal. And coal, of course, is dirty in many other ways in terms of its local impacts on forests, on the Adivasis that live in those forests, on the air pollution that coal creates, and so on. But it's the only fossil fuel that's available. And if we acknowledge that there will be a certain amount of fossil fuel needed for developmental purposes, then we cannot really talk about phasing out of coal. We should be thinking in terms of equitable use of the coal in a minimal manner across a large number of years, rather than talk about an unrealistic goal of phasing out coal. So unfortunately, if you look at what's happened in the global climate negotiations, this isn't a cartoon from 1992, where this person in an Impala is saying, yo, amigo, we need that tree to protect us from the greenhouse effect. And nothing much has really changed now. The language is global warming or it's climate change instead of greenhouse effect, but the same pressure on the global south to save a few trees, to plant more trees in order to take off the responsibility from the global north. So I think we need to remember that the global north is hugely responsible. It needs to actually reduce its emissions to zero by 2030, including Canada. Canada is fairly at the top of emissions per capita in the global north. In addition, must pay compensation and help in adaptation in the global south. But the global south also must make sure that it addresses the problem, this complex problem of development, sustainability, and justice in an honest and democratic manner. Thank you.
you so much, Sharat. There was so much to think about there. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions in the discussion. Okay, so I'll quickly then move on to invite Nick to speak.
Thank you very much. I have to say it's an honor to be part of this panel, and I appreciate being here and listening to the previous presentations, particularly identifying some of the complexities in South Asia internally, and addressing some of the issues around the relationship between the global North and the global South. So I'm with Seniors for Climate Action now, and we have formed more recently in the last couple of years. Our objective is to mobilize seniors to become part of the climate justice movement. We see the absolute need to expand the movement by inspiring people in Canada to stop the use of fossil fuels, educate and focus attention on Canada's role in the world, its responsibilities to the global South, and building up united global action and action here in Canada. We're attempting to learn to listen to Indigenous people's worldviews and trying to shift our own thinking to living in harmony with the natural world. We're beginning support action for Indigenous struggles. We're part of building a grassroots movement. We're responding to government policies with letters and writing and briefs and submissions, divestment campaigns, but we are also collaborating and participating in actions with climate justice groups and as part of the climate justice movement. We're growing from 40 people a couple of years ago to 250 now. We found that many seniors are supportive, that they're concerned about for themselves and for the future. They're concerned about the future generations. They don't want to believe behind a world that goes up in flame. We're part of a growing movement in this country for climate action, but there is a lot more to be done, and there's not much time to do it. So we as an organization, in some senses remain separated from the South Asian community. Like we tend to be, we want to heal some of that gap. And we believe that it's really important to do education on the role that Canada is playing in the world and the importance of challenging that. So Dr. Lele already addressed some of the issues in terms of the global North, and I don't really have a lot to add to that because I was going to go into it a little bit more, and I don't think it's necessary. The issues have been outlined quite well there. But I think what we can just to stress that the North needs to accept its responsibility to the world, and Canada in particular. So, and there's a need for global urgent action. So on the issue of urgency, we can just look at some of the statements that the head of the United Nations, Guterres, has issued in the last few years. In 2021, he called the most recent IPCC report at the time as a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening. The evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. Last year, before COP27, he in defending his use of apocalyptic language, he said, why do you use the language? For the simple reason that we are approaching tipping points. Tipping points will make climate breakdown irreversible. That damage will not allow us to recover and to contain temperature rises. And as we are approaching these tipping points, we need to increase the urgency. We need to increase the ambition. We need to rebuild trust, and mainly between the North and the South. And finally, this year, he said, just recently, in response to the news that Exxon, the massive oil company, knew in 1970 and actually predicted with almost uncanny foresight the rise in global temperatures and the impact, and then turned around and buried the evidence and pushed to say that the climate people were talking about climate change were unreasonable and denied the evidence. And he said in response to that, fossil fuel producers and enablers are still racing to expand production, knowing full well that this business model is inconsistent with human survival. This insanity belongs in science fiction, yet we know the ecosystem meltdown is cold, hard, scientific fact. What is Canada's role? I'll talk a little bit about that. Canada is the second highest, and depending how you measure it, the highest per capita emitting country in the world. So that gives it then, I think Dr. Lele noted that. We're the fourth largest exporter of oil. We're the ninth highest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms, and the only country with a population of less than 100 million people in the top 10 historical emitters. We punch very high when it comes to the climate crisis, well beyond our population. What is also not understood is that Canada is committed to ongoing production of and export of oil and natural gas. The theory is that oil production emissions can be offset by carbon capture, by burying carbon produced in the ground with unproven technologies and unproven possible results. That natural gas can be converted to hydrogen, which is a zero emitter, of course, and that therefore we produce natural gas, convert it to hydrogen, and all will be well, except that it ignores the role that natural gas, which is methane, and is a significantly higher impact in terms of carbon emissions, the continued production of it and transport of it, et cetera, the role that plays in global warming. We also suggest in Canadian policy that there are nuclear options which are unproven that will be a solution, and that we can plant more trees, even though in Canada the net effect in terms of in forestation is that it's actually an emitter more than a carbon sink. And in fact, Canada sent a letter to the EU when the EU is currently considering new regulations that would limit EU exports, the European Union, import of products linked to deforestation. Canada sent a letter from the Canadian ambassador to the EU, which said that the rules that the EU was considering would be burdensome requirements and will hurt trade between Canada and the European Union. In other words, Canada is not playing a role that's really about reducing and addressing the fundamental problems, but its strategy is one to continue fossil fuel production. So the greatest cost of climate breakdown has been mentioned is borne not by the industrialized world, which is most responsible, but by those in the global south who didn't cause it. The climate breakdown is severe. In particular, it intensifies the suffering of the working class and the poorest. The suffering in South Asia is a result primarily of emissions from the north, including, of course, Canada. There needs to be education about and action on the responsibility of the north to the south, and in particular about Canada, the role that Canada plays and the role that it should be playing instead. There has to be more than words. There has to be real action. Global warming is impacting on the South Asian community in Canada and will affect the living, working, and health conditions of South Asian, as well as other working class people in the country. And there needs to be common cause and broad support in mobilizing for measures to alleviate those impacts. So together with the global south, we can act to protect the global environment, but we have to recognize our responsibilities and build a climate justice movement together. The impacts in South Asia and the rest of the world will only intensify as the impact on the lowest income people will continue to intensify. Canada forms part of a global trading system that inhibits developing countries from charting their own course. A system widely recognized as impoverishing the global south. And we believe that Canada has an obligation to break the chains that restrict development in the south. In general, in ongoing terms, that means we need to guarantee Indigenous rights in the global south and in all Canadian, related to all Canadian climate aid and trade. We have to guarantee the free and prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples in the global south over traditional territories, and the right to refuse the use of their territories as carbon offsets for high greenhouse gas emitters in the global north, provide financial and technical supports, no strings attached, that allow countries in the global south or assist countries in the global south to develop low carbon economic pathways, assume an extra burden of GHG, greenhouse gas emission reductions to make room for economic development in the south, provide Canada's share of relief for international debt to those countries held hostage to international banks, provide more investments in social infrastructure with particular emphasis on programs for women, and advocate for fair trade policies. Canada is to a large extent doing its best to avoid its financial responsibilities and its responsibilities to the rest of the world in favor of continuing to export oil. The government needs to address international climate funding, commit more of the funding to gender-based and community projects, and accelerate the financial aid and shift more to the assistance to grants rather than loans. So we need to step up the effort to unite with people around the world. Here in Canada, we have to do that. We need to integrate education about and take action on demanding Canada meet its responsibilities to the South and to the world. We believe we need a powerful grassroots movement, which, while recognizing the historical responsibility of Indigenous nations in Canada, a movement to demand emergency action on carbon emissions. We need to broaden that movement for real climate change to include all communities in the country, and we need to communicate with and learn from each other here in Canada, as well as develop common action. We see, one of our objectives is to support the youth movement. And we see in the youth movement in Canada that there is more of a connection between the different communities, and in particular, young South Asian people are taking a leading role in the youth movement. But in general, we as an organization, and I think in the climate movement more generally, have not bridged that gap and have not highlighted in terms of the work we do some of our responsibilities internationally. So we hope the discussion today will help begin to consider some of those issues and look at what we can do in terms of the climate movement here. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Nick, for putting all this in perspective and for really pointing to some of the obligations of Canadians. I was going to start off by raising some questions myself, but I think that it would be, people have been listening, people will have a lot of questions. And so I think we should perhaps just move to audience questions. So I would invite people to either just raise the hand on the Zoom hand, and then I will call on you. Or if you would prefer to just put a question in chat, then you could do that, and we will pick your question from chat or read it out from chat. So if people have questions, and if someone wants to start off with a question, that would be fantastic. We can see that there's a real kind of diverse, obviously very shared kind of analysis in terms of an overarching analysis from our speakers, but also very particular kind of focus with Nausheen, giving a sense of what's happening, especially in urban areas, and the kinds of impacts right down to the mental health impacts on women, which I think is just a really interesting kind of layer to think about the ways in which people bear these burdens in their bodies in different ways. And then Sharon talking, of course, to the much, both the impacts for specific people working highly dependent on resources and resource ecologies in their work, like farmers and fish workers, but also then posing the big questions that Nick then also elaborated on, the kind of global politics, global justice questions. So I think we have sort of a range of areas that we've heard about, just indicating the complexity of the problem. And I think people will have all sorts of questions. So if there's a question to start off.
Yeah, my question was basically, would an international nonprofit insurance agency funded by all nations based on progressive principles, for instance, average national income per capita or some other metric, under the auspices of the UN and with loss and damage and reconstruction responsibility, makes sense with regard to the immediate challenges around the ongoing, catastrophes that are happening?
Yeah, I can try to just answer very briefly. I think, George, the simple answer would be yes. The devil is always in the details. Some of it is about insurance, but some of it is also about just, transfer of funds for loss and damage that has already occurred in a sense, so the insurance part might take care of the future, so that it addresses future events that might happen in a random manner across the global south. But you would also need to look at what has already happened and compensate for loss and damage through that metric. As we can see in the latest COP, loss and damage on the one side was accepted for the first time as a principle for compensation, but on the other hand, all the track record of actual transfer of financial support tells us that not a whole lot will end up being transferred, and it constantly gets repackaged as aid when it is in fact investment by the private sector is also being called aid, and so on and so forth. So I think yes, insurance is part of the story. A non-profit globally sort of a UN based insurance would be really useful, but we will probably have to go in many more, sort of add many more layers to that to ensure that something effective does take place.
Yeah, mine is a similar, my question will probably get a similar answer, which is like, the problem with this whole, the theory is fine, funds should be transferred, but we know the reality on the ground of, democracy doesn't get set in place by the transfer of funds, and without democracy you don't get any of the positive benefits from the transfer of funds. So what are we really talking about is my question.
Maybe Nausheen, would you like to sort of go first, and then Sharad, just to hear from both of you?
Sure, I think so. Just sort of taking forward slightly what Sharad had highlighted earlier, which was an incredibly important point, and also connects with Sarah's question, which is also a very important one, that what is the most substantive issue here? What's really the fundamental challenge here? So, so just very briefly, in the context of the pledges for loss and damages that have been made to Pakistan coming out of the recent round of meetings that have taken place, I think the last one took place at Geneva, if I'm not mistaken, and was led by our climate minister, Sherry Rahman. And so these are actually pledges which are actually more like loans. So they're not like outright money that's going to be literally handed over in the form of charity to Pakistan. So I think that these kinds of dynamics are embedded in long-standing relationships, highly unequal relationships and debt burdens that really have squeezed nation states in the global south for a very, very long time now. And this is a relational dynamic that also in turn shapes the developmental paradigm that has unfolded over the last century, whether it's deals with financing developmental projects, that are also partly responsible, the kinds of infrastructures that have been built, the real estate projects, and when I'm thinking of, I have cities in mind over here, specifically the concrete and cement that has been poured onto the surfaces of very large territories and urban centers, the kind of financing that has enabled all of this to happen, that these pledges and these so-called, also very important, the discourse around this is also very important. To what extent are we actually seeing any sort of, a glimmer of hope in terms of a substantive change in our ways of thinking about this relationship between the North and the South? This is connected with what Sharad had pointed out earlier so brilliantly, but this relational aspect that goes back over the last 100+ years, which is about debt, which is about the debt burden, which is about, pushing all kinds of burdens onto the global North, very extractive techniques. We really haven't gotten ourselves out of these yet. So the needle hasn't really moved in a very substantial way at all. And again, I think this echoes what Sharad pointed out earlier, that are we still really only in terms of that cartoon, are we still stuck in that phase? And so I think that the more fundamental issues really are about, are we looking at paradigm shifts? Are we looking at shifts in responsibilities and relationships, in all of these kinds of things, right? So, and democratic agendas, et cetera, are all a part of this, but democracy is also complicit in this. And so, democracy, democratic systems are also part of this broader dynamic. So so I think that this is where the needle hasn't shifted yet, and it's very, very frustrating.
After that, Aparna, we have Jim, who has raised his hand.
Okay, this goes back to the flooding. Shireen mentioned that before the floods, there was a severe hot, dry spell in Pakistan. And I'm wondering if this, followed by the flood, has resulted in a large amounts of soil loss due to erosion.
Yes, in answer to Jim's question, yes, well, I'm not an expert on this, but this is very much what climate scientists and people on ground who are experts on this are saying. And it's sort of, the runoff factor. And so the sort of conditions that the heat waves, enabled on ground very much in the southern parts of Pakistan, that in turn made the effects of these unprecedented monsoon rainfall and the subsequent floods even worse. That definitely there's a connection in terms of that, and that we're likely to see this sort of this sort of very lethal combination of these heat waves and then these crazy rainfall floods, that we might see this happen again. Again, the uncertainty, this tremendous uncertainty in terms of when this might happen again, but that this kind of a scenario may very well repeat itself in the near future.
Thanks, Nausheen. I'll just go back to the earlier question because, Sarah's question can be sort of thought of at multiple levels. So just to make it a little bit more concrete, if I were an individual living in the global north and wanting to support climate adaptation work in the global south, what should I do? At an individual level, I would say, do not give money to governments. Certainly not the kinds of governments that we have in place in much of the global south, where the money will disappear down a black hole. The Indian government currently is extremely undemocratic and opaque in the way it functions. So I would definitely say build people-to-people bridges and try to get funds across, to very targeted groups that are working in particular areas. Because as an individual, we can only do so much. So we might as well put in that additional effort to find people, like-minded people working on the ground and support them directly. The second thing I think what individuals in the global north can do is target for change in aid policies of their own government. And I think it's interesting, the Canadian aid policy is a bit of a paradox in the sense, for a long time, I used to think of Canadian aid policy as being more liberal, more sort of decent as compared to US aid. But on the climate change issue, the Canadian aid policy is no different. It is still about throwing money at adaptation in the global south, but not looking at the mitigation question at home. And increasingly, the reform that I'm talking about is the fact that increasingly aid is being, it's investment that is being repackaged as aid, because we've had conservative governments for many years that have basically redefined aid as well, just promoting Canadian business interests abroad. And so it's investment and business interests that get repackaged as aid. So I think I would ask concerned citizens in Canada to really look at their aid policy and try to reform that aid policy. And hidden in that aid policy also is the other problem, which has been persistent across decades of development aid, which is that there's a hidden agenda to make sure that 40% of that aid comes back to their own country as, for consultancy money and all other kinds of ways of moving the money back. And I see that in the UK, I see that in the US, I see that in Canadian aid, and so many other contexts where you give aid with one hand and then impose conditions like, you guys need to hire a bunch of consultants from our country in order to make you use that aid properly. And that's just a way of moving that money back to your own country. So that is also a reform that is required in broadly the development aid sector. And the third would be to putting pressure on your government to increase the quantum of aid, but also again to make that aid so much more targeted and maybe take it out of the clutches of undemocratic governments and make sure that it is not just government to government, but also government to individual dedicated actors on the ground. And I know it's easier said than done, but I just wanted to put it in more concrete terms, what a person in Canada perhaps can try to do at their individual and collective level.
Yeah,
Pat, would you like to pose your question, please?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm so much better informed. Thank you. We all know that it's easier to pressure politicians to act, do the right things when they don't worry about losing votes. And I think this is part of what we're trying to do at SCAN is to move that pressure along to the higher levels. But so I'm wondering, in your countries, where obviously your people are suffering much more than people have in our country at the moment, anyway. And do you get any pushback within your countries from people who deny climate change, or is there a broad consensus that would help to move your agendas forward?
Nausheen, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you, Sharad. I think in Pakistan, people on ground by and large are, there's a very strong collective now and a consensus across the board that climate change is real and that its impacts are devastating. And Pakistan has, over the last several decades, gone through such unprecedented, I mean, the word unprecedented seems to become, I know, sort of one needs to invent a new vocabulary with each passing year to be able to describe the sorts of impacts and effects that we're witnessing on ground and observing. So I think by and large, people know this is a reality, and there are absolutely amazing collectives, climate change activists and non-governmental organizations, and even government officials. The climate ministry in Pakistan, with the new climate minister on board, Shari Rahman, has been a very active, a very vocal, and a sort of a fairly hard-hitting, in comparison to what we had in the past, has made a tremendous effort to bring the climate change issue to the forefront, both within and outside of Pakistan, and very much led this discussion forward on loss and damages at the COP last year. The issue then isn't so much whether there is a pushback. There is actually a collective, there's a consensus that the climate change is real. The issue really is, how do you surmount the challenges? And this is about governance, right? And the deep, dark abyss that is the well of governance. And, you look down that well, and then you see these complexities of colonial, post-colonial, governance dynamics, these legacies, these histories that I've talked about, structural dynamics, inequalities, centralized forms of rule in Pakistan. Pakistan is now a hybrid state. We can't talk about governance in Pakistan without also bringing the Pakistan military to the forefront. And so it is interesting that the talk of climate now is also being connected to the talk of security. And whilst there are many different forms of security, what takes precedence is national security. And then suddenly everybody, at the top starts to talk more about climate change. Whereas on ground, there are other issues of security about livelihood and mental health and the body and, these sorts of things, the security of refuge, the security of shelter, the security of tenure. These sorts of issues of security don't come to the forefront quite the same way as national security concerns come to the forefront. And this has to do with deep regional histories. It has to do with Afghanistan. We could go on and on about this. So it's these kinds of contradictions that are actually, that pose a much bigger challenge for us in Pakistan. Then how do you make that, that dollar or that rupee, well, not so much the rupee, which is now, sort of losing value second by second, but how do you make the dollars and the sterling and that aid count on ground? Because it has to flow through these governance channels that, that are embedded in, that are anchored in these deep, complex, challenges of, of unequal structures of governance and inequalities, regional, urban, rural, and so forth. And this is the big challenge that I see. So even from an educational aspect, and I believe in that question, the question of education was also posed. Universities within Pakistan, even high schools, are now increasingly bringing climate change issues to the forefront. Climate change is being discussed. And but then again, I think if you don't have the governance issue sorted, then then these challenges become insurmountable. So for me, this is the governance issue is the big issue.
If I can just add to Nausheen's excellent answer, it's a paradox that we do not have climate deniers by and large. Certainly not the local communities, who see the impact of climate change daily. Certainly not the poor. The biggest climate deniers used to be in academia. People who, upper class people who, scientists in particular, who are the physicists and chemists who are saying, oh, well, I don't know whether the evidence is really there till about 10 years ago. But now nobody's really denying that. And the problem is about being honest about thinking about climate change. So what tends to happen, as Nausheen pointed out, is climate change becomes a very convenient argument that is used and misused in a variety of ways. And I'll give you one example from our work on water. When we started looking at the drying of rivers around Bangalore as a part of a big research project, by the way, ironically funded by IDRC Canada, we went to the government of Karnataka to discuss how they could give us access to certain data. And the secretary of the Water Resources Department said, look, I know you guys will start talking about what conflict over water and human rights and all this kind of stuff. Really, the answer is very simple. The drying of the rivers is because of climate change, and I want your research to show that. And in fact, our research found that that was not the case. The river had been drying over a 60-year period, and the climate signal was very, very small. And the reason that the river was drying was because of excessive groundwater pumping and planting of water consumptive crops and so on and so forth, building of dams, things like human actions that preceded climate change. And therefore, climate change is a convenient peg or a convenient stick to beat the dog, but the real problems may lie elsewhere, as Nausheen said, with the larger notions of how you carry about development, who benefits from development, how decisions are taken on these questions. So it's the opposite of climate denial. It's like convenient use of climate change arguments to hide what is really going on in many cases, and using climate change to cry hoarse in international arenas for increased transfer of funds without the same kind of honesty then in terms of determining who within the country should be held responsible, whose development should be prioritized, and whose development can be put on hold because they're already the top 10%, the elite, who are over-consuming. I mean, a student of mine did an analysis of the carbon footprint within the country. And although even the highest 10% are nowhere near the average Canadian or American footprint, nevertheless, they are above any kind of sustainable carbon emission level. So I think it's the opposite problem. We don't deny climate change, but we use it to, for example, increase nuclear power generation, saying it is carbon neutral. We use it to build big dams because that's carbon neutral, and ignore all the other devastating impacts that these kinds of projects would have.
I think, Aparna, we have a very good sort of question from Gail. She's a climate activist and very knowledgeable, and she's looking to see if there are groups which can join and work with in Pakistan and in India. That would be amazing outcome of this session.
Just wondering if Nick could just say what he's been wanting to say. I mean, sort of say a few words, and then maybe we can have the speakers address Gail's question as a sort of final response, just given that the time. I mean, I think there'd be questions, and we would love to stay for another half an hour, but I am aware that the time is quite late in Pakistan and India, so we shouldn't keep them for much longer. So maybe after Nick, we would just have Nausheen and Sharat speak to that final question from Gail, and then we could wrap up. Nick, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So assuming that this is what I'll close my comments as well, but I wanted to talk a bit about the issue of government aid and how it's tied to investment that was raised. And I think it's important. So a couple things about that. One is that the global strategy that's being negotiated through the COP meetings, and in particular since the Paris Accord in 2015, is a market-based approach. And this feeds quite well into the idea that it's about investment and it's about competition for different countries in terms of selling, alternative renewable energy technologies, et cetera. And it reinforces the traditional relationship between the North and the South, which is primarily an economic domination, and that's important and significant. And so it's going to be necessary to challenge that approach for that reason alone, if not for a number of others, around how we deal with the climate crisis. And finally, I don't presume to understand the best way to approach issues of democracy in the South, but I do think we can say is that it's important for us to build support and support for and connection with people in the global South, direct connections and build alliances, because that's what's going to be a way we can be, to some degree instrumental, both in terms of educating our own population and in building the kind of global movement that's going to be necessary. And I just want to personally thank the two speakers. It's been a really very, very interesting and very informative and very helpful presentations. And thanks for the opportunity for being here.
Would Nausheen or Sharad, who would like to go first, just to respond to the question of, are there senior civil society groups focused on climate change in India and Pakistan with which SCAN could develop a relationship to share interest and information?
So very quickly, I'm not aware of any civil society groups that work on climate activists, which are necessarily sort of age focused. The ones that I know quite intimately, people that I have worked with, people whose opinions I rely upon considerably and I learn from, there are a wide-ranging groups across Sindh and Balochistan, and typically they are made up of people of all ages. And so especially those who work on or sort of are active from an indigenous rights perspective, we see men and women of sort of a wide spectrum of ages, and a lot of respect, especially for those who are sort of more elderly. And so I could very easily connect SCAN with these groups, and they're just doing amazing work, and sort of young, middle-aged, sort of slightly older, and all of them just incredibly knowledgeable. And it's a wonderful question, and I'm so glad that SCAN would be interested in connecting with those kinds of activists on ground. So I'll be happy to connect you with those groups and individuals.
Same here. There aren't, I think, specifically senior citizen groups, exclusively senior citizen groups working on this issue, but there are a very large number that I can perhaps suggest a few of them to SCAN.
And Sarah has also put in the chat that there is a group in Chennai that she can connect people to if they're interested. So I think with that, we're going to have to call this to a close today. I would like to offer my deepest thanks to all our speakers, to Dr. Sharad Lele, Dr. Nausheen Anwar, to Nick Carlo for giving us really so much to think about. So much of a sense of the complexities of the issues, but also some possibility of how we can think more constructively and productively about them, and how we can make alliances going forward. So thank you so much. Thank you to SCAN for organizing this, for all the co-organizers or co-sponsors of this event, and also, of course, to all the audience members for joining us and for making this such a useful and productive interaction. I just wanted to announce that as you know, this is being recorded. It will be made available both on the website of jamhoor.org, which is one of the co-sponsors of the event, as well as SCAN's own website. And we'll share the link with the speakers, of course, and with anyone else who writes to ask for it. I think that was it in terms of any questions that people would have had. In terms of getting contacts, we can certainly, make that happen in terms of names of civil society organizations and so on. I can facilitate that with Sharad and Nausheen and people who are interested. So thank you very much, and I think we can say goodbye now. Good night to
thank you.
Both of you.
Good night, everyone.
Karachi
Thank you very much.